Right now, as you're watching this, something small, quiet, and almost invisible could be eating away at one of the most expensive structures you own. Not through force, not through disaster, but through patience. It doesn't crash, it doesn't break loudly, and it doesn't announce itself. It spreads slowly, holds moisture like a trap, and weakens materials from the inside until the damage is already irreversible. Most people dismiss it as harmless. By the time they realize what's happening, they're no longer dealing with a maintenance issue. They're staring at a full structural replacement. What makes this especially frustrating is that the solution has existed for centuries. It's cheap, accessible, and backed by both historical evidence and modern science. Yet most people never hear about it until it's too late. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't fit neatly into a system built around expensive fixes and repeat services. Today, we're going to break that pattern. This is not theory. This is a chain of knowledge stretching from medieval architecture to 19th century disease outbreaks to modern material science. And by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how to stop a slow, silent form of destruction before it costs you thousands. Let's get into it. The real threat begins with understanding what you are actually dealing with when you see moss on a surface. Moss is not just a plant sitting harmlessly on top of something. It is one of the oldest living organisms on Earth, dating back roughly 450 million years. Long before trees, long before flowering plants, moss had already perfected a survival strategy that makes it incredibly effective at colonizing surfaces. Unlike most plants, moss doesn't rely on roots to draw water from the soil. Instead, it absorbs moisture directly through its entire structure. Every cell acts like a sponge. That means any damp surface becomes a perfect habitat. But the real problem lies in how it anchors itself. Moss uses microscopic structures known as rhizoids. These are not roots in the traditional sense, but they act like tiny hooks, gripping into the smallest cracks and pores of whatever surface they land on. Once established, the moss begins holding moisture against that surface continuously. This is where the damage escalates. Water trapped by moss doesn't evaporate quickly, it lingers. In colder conditions, that trapped water freezes and expands. When temperatures rise, it thaws again. This constant cycle of freezing and thawing acts like a slow mechanical force, widening cracks, lifting materials, and breaking down structural integrity over time. The damage is not immediate, which is why it's so often ignored. But over a few seasons, the effect compounds. Materials begin to warp, protective layers degrade, and underlying structures start to rot. By the time visible failure appears, the process has already been underway for years. To understand how people once dealt with this problem effectively, you have to step back into history. Long before modern synthetic materials existed, builders in medieval Europe didn't have access to advanced polymers or chemical coatings. What they had was observation. Across regions like Scandinavia and the British Isles, a pattern began to emerge. Structures that used copper in their construction, particularly in roofing, remained remarkably free of organic growth. While nearby buildings would quickly develop moss, algae, and decay, copper-covered surfaces stayed clean. This wasn't a one-off observation. It repeated itself across generations. Churches, cathedrals, and important public structures built with copper maintained their integrity for decades, even centuries, with minimal biological interference. Builders didn't initially understand why this worked, but they recognized the consistency of the result. One of the most well-documented examples comes from Christ Church in Philadelphia. Constructed in the 18th century, its copper roofing became the subject of later scientific analysis. After more than 200 years of exposure, the material showed minimal degradation. Even more importantly, it resisted the kind of biological growth that typically accelerates structural decay. This wasn't luck. It was chemistry at work, even if the builders themselves didn't fully understand the mechanism. The scientific explanation for this phenomenon didn't arrive until centuries later. And interestingly, it came from a completely different field. In the mid-19th century, during repeated cholera outbreaks in Paris, a physician named Victor Burke made a curious observation. Workers in copper-related industries appeared to be unusually resistant to the disease. At a time when cholera was devastating entire populations, this anomaly stood out. Burke began investigating and eventually gathered data across multiple regions and industries. His findings suggested that regular exposure to copper had a protective effect against microbial threats. Years later, this observation would be explained scientifically through what became known as the oligodynamic effect. This principle describes how certain metals, including copper and zinc, release ions that are toxic to microorganisms, even in extremely small concentrations. These ions disrupt essential biological processes. They interfere with cell membranes, damage internal structures, and prevent organisms from carrying out basic functions like photosynthesis or reproduction. For moss, algae, and fungi, this effect is devastating. What medieval builders observed without explanation was now fully understood. Copper wasn't just a durable material. It was actively hostile to the very organisms that cause long-term structural damage. The question then becomes obvious. If copper is so effective, why isn't it used everywhere today? The answer isn't complicated, it's cost. Copper is expensive, significantly more so than modern alternatives like asphalt or composite materials. It also requires stronger structural support and specialized installation. For most residential applications, it simply isn't practical. But here's where things get interesting. While you may not be able to install a copper roof, you can still use the same underlying principle in a far more accessible way. This is where zinc enters the picture. Zinc shares similar antimicrobial properties with copper. When exposed to water, it releases ions that carry the same destructive effect against moss and other organic growth. And unlike copper roofing, zinc can be applied in simple, affordable forms. One of the most effective methods involves zinc sulfate, a basic mineral compound that can be found in most garden or agricultural supply stores. When applied to a surface and activated by rainwater, it dissolves slowly and spreads across the material. As it moves, it carries zinc ions into any existing moss or algae. The process that follows is precise and efficient. The moss absorbs the zinc-infused water directly through its cells. Once inside, the ions begin disrupting critical biological functions. One of the key targets is chlorophyll, the molecule responsible for photosynthesis. When this system is compromised, the organism can no longer produce energy from sunlight. At the same time, the zinc induces oxidative stress within the cells, breaking down their internal structure. Over the course of a few weeks, the moss loses its ability to sustain itself, dries out, detaches, and is gradually removed by natural elements like wind and rain. No aggressive cleaning, no mechanical damage. It's just a chemical process working quietly in the background. But understanding the science is only part of the equation. Applying it correctly is what makes the difference between a temporary fix and long-term prevention. The most effective approach is to apply zinc sulfate along the highest point of the surface, allowing gravity and rainfall to distribute it naturally. Timing matters. You want a dry period immediately after application so the material can settle before being activated by moisture. Coverage also matters. Too little and the effect is limited. Too much and you risk unnecessary environmental impact. The goal is controlled, even distribution that allows the zinc to do its job without excess runoff. And this is where responsibility comes into play. The same property that makes zinc effective against moss also makes it potentially harmful to aquatic ecosystems. If runoff enters streams or drainage systems, it can affect fish and other organisms. Managing this is straightforward but essential. Redirecting initial runoff into soil or vegetation allows the ground to filter and bind the zinc before it reaches waterways. It's a simple step, but one that ensures the solution remains both effective and responsible. There are also alternative approaches for those in sensitive environments. Zinc strips installed along ridgelines can provide a slower, more controlled release over time. Improving sunlight exposure by trimming overhanging vegetation can also reduce the conditions that allow moss to thrive in the first place. What ties all of this together is a larger pattern that shows up repeatedly throughout history. The most effective solutions are often the simplest ones, rooted in observation and refined over time. But when those solutions don't align with modern economic incentives, they tend to fade from common knowledge. There's no conspiracy here. It's just a system that naturally amplifies what can be marketed and repeated, while quieter, one-time solutions receive less attention. And that's why this knowledge matters. Not because it's revolutionary, but because it's practical, something you can apply directly, with minimal cost and see real results. So here's what you should take from this. Pay attention to early signs of biological growth. Act before the damage becomes structural. Use proven methods that work with natural processes instead of against them. And always consider the broader impact of what you apply. If this kind of deep dive into real applicable history is what you're here for, make sure you subscribe to Intelligent Survival. Share this with someone who might be overlooking a problem that could cost them thousands. And as always, stay sharp, stay informed, and keep learning from the past.